to 310, which is our heading, and 9 knots, which is the speed. We're going to input that information right there. Okay. Now we're going to press execute. That screen is done. Oops, sorry. Next thing, we're going to go to N1 limit. You don't have to worry too much about this. There's a trick I learned that I'll actually have to try to explain another time because it's somewhat complex to understand. But you can take your static air temperature, which is usually located in this top left corner here, on where it displays your engine information. You also get your outside air temperature, which is 18 degrees Celsius. What I sometimes do is I'll enter in 1 degree higher than what is listed, and what that does is it changes how the autopilot or the auto throttle derates the engines on acceleration for takeoff. But that's something that would have to be explained another time. So this screen, really there's not a whole lot to do for this screen. So next I'm going to go to takeoff. What I'm going to do is I'm going to type in what my flap setting will be, which I would like to use flaps 5. Enter that right under flaps. Next I'm going to enter in my center of gravity. Do that, you click the button right next to it. It's going to pop up a number. You press it again to input your center of gravity, and it's going to tell you your trim setting, which is going to be 4.62. So what I'll do is I'm going to input my trim setting, which is currently it's at 4. I'm just going to use my scroll wheel a few times till I get close to it. Oh, I'm sorry. Keep going some more. Right there, 4.64 is pretty damn close. So well, that's the value we're going to use. Last step before we can finish this up, we have our V speeds that need to be calculated here. You'll notice right here, right next to the horizontal or artificial horizon, we've got our speed in knots, and then right next to it in yellow it says no V speed. What I'll do is I'm going to enter in our 3 V speeds by clicking the buttons right next to them. And now our V speeds are going to display in green, so we know what our V speeds are. So we're pretty much done with the initial route planning and weight and balance and all that garbage. That's pretty much done. So now they're just going to get the aircraft ready to fly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a couple test checks to make sure that everything functions properly. There is a way with PMDG you can toggle a setting whenever you want to make it so that random equipment failures can happen. So it's always a good idea to check if you have that set, just to make sure things are working properly. This is your overspeed test, these 2 buttons here. This is your stall warning test, those buttons there. You can test the display here by turning this to the test option. Then if you go down to the next panel, you can power, it's hard to see sometimes. You can do this test here, for which is an overheat test related to your AC. Make sure nothing is overheating. You can press that button just to make sure that things illuminate. You have a window heating test. You just flip that in both directions, make sure both those lights illuminate. You can go down and look right next to the throttle quadrant. You've got a switch here. When you use this in both directions, that tests the lighting and the system for the fire suppression in case one of the engines catches fire. And then on the other side you have another one to make sure that the lighting works. You have this button here, which is a system test, and when I click this, you'll see that on these monitors down here, it's gonna run a couple of tests.
Pull up. Wind shear. Wind shear. Wind shear. Terrain. Terrain. Pull up.
And then once the screen goes back to normal, that means that the test is complete. So that test is done. Okay. Now the next thing you can test is your TCAS, which is this square panel right here in the middle column of your communications panel. So to test your TCAS, you press right in the little circle right there in the middle of the switch. You click that. When you click that, what it does is it runs its traffic or its collision avoidance test.
TCAS test pass.
Once you hear that TCAS test pass, means that everything is good. That test is done. I'm just gonna set a random squawk code in the event that some guy decides to be air traffic controller or something like that where I am or where I'm going. So he's just gonna give me a number eventually. I'm just putting something in random. Next thing, because I'm using VATSIM, it is a good idea to make usage of the radios. Where I am currently, there's nobody who has themselves listed as an air traffic controller in my area. If any of this was blue around, that means that there's somebody who's doing a center office, you can call it, and they control, basically whoever is the center controller controls airspace, everything within that shape, that blue shape around them. There's also airport tower and ground and approach and things like that, but where I am in Salt Lake City, there's nothing going on. So because of that, I'm going to go to what's called Unicom, which is just universal communications. You don't have to go through anything with air traffic control or anything. You just communicate with other pilots within your region directly. The frequency for that is always going to be 122.80, so I'm going to set both of my radios to 122.80. I'm going to switch that to active. I'm going to do that on both sides. I'm going to switch. As far as the radio stuff goes, that's really all we're going to worry about for now. We won't really need to use the radios again unless we have to change frequency or comm frequency over, or if we're going to change our frequency for a nav when we get ready to do ILS. So most everything is done. At this point, we're going to do a couple more things, turn a few more things on. First thing we're going to turn on is the APU. We're going to need APU in order to get the engine started. So we're going to go to the APU switch here. I'm going to click it once, and then we're going to click it again. And what's going to happen is this exhaust gas temperature gauge, EGT, is going to rise. It's going to peak out somewhere, and then it's going to drop back down. Once it drops back down, and it kind of stops, kind of levels out, that means that the APU is fully spooled up and ready to be used. So the exhaust gas temperature is starting to drop, so that means that the APU is almost ready. I also have a seatbelt sign, so we know that, you know, people don't die or anything like that. We also have this panel here. This is extremely important because this is going to determine how your aircraft auto pressurizes the cabin. Always just set this to whatever your cruise altitude is supposed to be. So in my case it's 36,000 feet. So I'll move this to 36,000 feet. That's it. I'm done. I don't need that anymore. Okay. Next, I'm going to turn on my hydraulic pumps. So that way control surfaces can get ready to be used. And once my hydraulic pumps are on, I'm going to press this switch here, which is yaw damper. What that does is it prevents the, or it makes it so that the yaw is always going to be centered unless there's a direct input from the captain. And this will prevent the aircraft mid-flight from losing control because of bad rudder input. So you're going to put that in. And this relies on the hydraulic pressure to be on. Okay. Next, we're going to turn on our probe heat. Generally, basically the idea of what I'm doing is you want to make sure that before you leave that there isn't anything that's illuminated in orange. Anything illuminated in orange, you need to turn your attention to it, because it means that you need to do something in order to extinguish the light. I have here this light here that says dual bleed. What that's referencing is that both my engine bleed switches and my APU bleed switches are turned on. Because I don't have the engines running, I don't need to have the engine bleed switches on. And what this does is it closes a couple of valves, so that way anything that's related to air conditioning and start valves or start air pressure is all going to be channeled through what's given out by the APU. So for now we only need APU bleed to be turned on. So now my APU is turned on. I'm going to tell the aircraft to begin using power in the APU gen, and we don't need the GPU power anymore. So what I'm going to do is, now that we have APU on, I want this display to tell me how much power is coming directly from the APU. So I switch this knob back up to APU gen. So we're almost done. I'm actually going to extinguish the master caution light because I know what it's trying to tell me. And I'm almost done with the setup here, so it's not a big deal. What I'm going to do, I'm close up a couple of doors. I'm going to go to ground connections, and I'm going to remove a couple of things like the air conditioning unit and the ground power, because we don't need those anymore. Next thing that I need to do is I need to change my barometric pressure setting on my altimeter. Easiest way for me to do that is go back to the Zavat Spy. I go back to the METAR, click on that, and that's going to tell me right here, right where it says A and then the 4 numbers, A3011. What that means is altimeter setting or barometric pressure needs to be set to 3011 for this given area. So to do that, I go right here. By default, since it's a Boeing American aircraft, it's going to be set to barometric pressure in inches. So I'm going to take this scroll wheel and I'm going to set that up to 3011, 4,220 feet, which is where it should be for where I am. Next, I'm going to preset my autopilot, so I know that anytime I'm flying below 10,000 feet, I need to be at a speed of around 250 knots, or maybe a little below. Initially, I'm going to set my altimeter to be maybe 8,000 feet until I'm ready to climb to my cruise altitude. I'm going to turn on both of my flight directors, because those are the only way for you to get your autopilot turned on later on down the line. Okay. Next, I'm going to do a last check of this panel. Notice there's still a few things that are highlighted in yellow. That's okay, because by the time I get the plane fired up with both engines, all of those lights are going to be out.